I would like to acknowledge that while we meet today on a virtual platform, Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples, where we continue to reflect on the ways in which we can work in collaboration with Indigenous communities to form mutual and ongoing relationships that respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future. QUESCREN receives funding from the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, Department of Canadian Heritage, and Concordia University. The Secrétariat is financing today's activity. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I invite William Flock, the Assistant Secretary of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, to say a few words. William?
Okay, thank you, Lorraine, and welcome everybody. I'd just like to highlight how much we've appreciated the work of QUESCREN in organizing these Lunch and Learn sessions now for the last couple of years. They represent an important opportunity for researchers to share their work with interested parties, other researchers, community members, as well as government officials. And that exchange of ideas and the opportunity to learn from experts is one that we all appreciate. So thank you, Lorraine and the team at QUESCREN again for organizing this event. I'm particularly interested and appreciative of the work over the years that Dorothy Williams has done in documenting the history of Blacks in Quebec and particularly in Montreal. And I'm really looking forward myself to learning more about this dimension, because I will say I don't know a lot about today's topic. So I'm going to get out of the way and allow Lorraine and Dorothy to share the knowledge with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks for those kind and supportive words, Mr. Flock. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy is an historian, author, educator, researcher, content developer, and media consultant, no less. She has authored 3 books and contributed to other scholarly and academic publications. Blacks in Montreal, 1628 to 1986, An Urban Demography, was written in 1989. In 97, The Road to Now, A History of Blacks of Montreal was released and remains the only chronological study of Montreal's Blacks. In 1998, Les Noirs à Montréal, Essai de démographie urbaine was released. In 2022, Dr. Williams was presented with the John Dennison Award for exemplifying excellence in the promotion of Canadian Black history and culture. With a strong Afrocentric perspective, Dr. Williams has conducted teacher training, professional and public presentations, and created pedagogical resources with the objective of making Black history accessible. Before I hand the floor over to Dr. Williams, I want to remind the audience to put any questions you have about the presentation into the chat, and we will address these during the question and answer period following the presentation. Over to you, Dorothy.
All right, such is the title of my presentation this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. I'm going to start off with defining really what I'm talking about. So I'm going, in this presentation, I'll be using words like domestic labor, caregiving, and I'm focused mostly on caregiving, but caregiving is one of those aspects that's imbued within domestic labor definition. So I put 2 here for us to look at, and you'll see where I have the emphasis is really about the caregiving aspect. And so this particular definition really is more focused on private houses and the kind of work that goes in the individual household. I'm hoping it will move. Okay, and here's another definition which I thought was far more, is much broader. and takes into account domestic work can go on outside of the home as well. People can be in institutions or in other people's homes, etc. But you'll notice how much of the definition is still about caring for people, the caregiving aspect of domestic work. And this is why the two are intrinsically linked. And I'd also say that looking at the oral history of domestic workers, particularly those from the 1950s, which I'm going to talk about later in the presentation, this caregiving part often is a deal breaker for them. It is integral to what they were supposed to do. It wasn't just cleaning the house. And for some of them, like I said, it was a deal breaker. So I just want to continue. The point of the caregiving aspect comes in this next part, which is really what I perceive to be the beginnings of that relationship between caregiving and Black labor, as defined, and it's defined within the historical documents that I found. So what I'm going to do today very quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of my time going through methodology and stuff because I want to get into the heart of it. I will be, just so that you know, there are 4 periods I'm going to be looking at, and each one has sort of got a key phrase that I pulled from the material that I was researching. So I will be talking about slavery. I will be talking about the modern era. So it's going to be a jump from the 18th century into the very early beginnings of the Black community development in Montreal. So that's what I mean by in the modern era. Then we jump approximately 20 to 30 years. There's some overlap, but we will jump into just prior to the Second World War and some of the issues attendant at that time the Black community faced, again, about caregiving. And then finally, our 4th period that we're going to be looking at is the post-war, which brings in typical, what we call the second domestic scheme, the household caregivers that I think most of us, if any of us, have done any research on domestic history, domestic labor history, this would figure very prominently in your research. So this would have been the 1950s. So that's sort of how I broke it down. And I just want to emphasize this is not a timeline. So there's going to be gaps. I'm trying to bring out certain, if you will, understanding of caregiving, not just from the pandemic period as an aspect of Black labor, but rather that it started in Quebec much earlier. And perhaps with future research, we'll be able to fill those gaps along the way as well. For now, those are the 4 periods that I'm going to be covering. Okay. So my first period, which is during slavery, has to do with evidence that is in what we call briefs, or actually letters that were sent back and forth between France and Quebec from the Conseil Supérieur, the Superior Council. The intendant and the governors at that time were in communication with Paris, with the court. So at one point it was the king, another point it was the regent. And as you can see here, these arguments were put forth or presented in 1689 to Louis XIV to convince him to allow the New France colonists here in Quebec to bring Black slaves, African slaves, directly from Africa into Quebec. And it's 1689, and the communications go back and forth. And it is basically, it originally is poo-pooed, and then eventually they agree to it. And apparently, the agreement comes with the idea that the African slaves will increase the value of the resource that they were here to collect, which was the furs. And so the fact that Blacks will wear beaver skins and the oils will change the value, if you will, of the pelts. So increasing the value as well. And they could wear these skins all year round, particularly in the winter. And that would be, well, at least in the king's perspective, it was a deal breaker, and he agreed. Unfortunately for them, for the colonists at that time, it never occurred. Slaves that they wanted to bring into Quebec never came, simply because within a few days of this agreement, France was at war. And France was at war in Europe meant that colony was also at war. So the idea of then giving up or devoting a ship from war maneuvers to going and getting Black slaves to bring them into Quebec, that was a no-no, and it was put aside. So it took a while. The treaty, I believe it was the Treaty of Ryswick, and then we had some more back and forth. It took until 1719. Jean, who also saw, in his view, the value of having Negro slaves, bringing them into the colony. So he also saw them as being profitable and would help to solve what New France had almost from the beginning, which was a chronic labor shortage. And that's how he perceived, and a lot of the colonists perceived, they could solve the labor shortage in the province by bringing in a slave ship. This argument that Béjean puts together in 1719 doesn't really get resolved till around 1722. And then the regent or the court in Paris agrees again to allow slaves to be brought into Quebec, just like before. At that point, there was some problems with the India Company, which had the responsibility from the Conseil de la Marine to bring in slaves on the particular ships. They would be assigned, and they didn't want to do that because they felt at that time that they would get more money if they brought those slaves directly to the West Indies rather than to Quebec, because Quebec wouldn't pay the same for those slaves, even though Béjean wrote back and said, yes, yes, we will. And in fact, we have pre-sold 100 slaves. And if you know anything about slave ships, they carry anywhere from 200 to 400 people at a time crammed in. I don't have any pictures of slave ships, but it already, the main cargo would be at least 200 slaves. He guaranteed through his subscription service that 100 colonists in New France had already paid to have their African slaves brought in. So it didn't happen. I think what triggered my interest in this whole story, and I started to look at it very different, is the idea that he articulates that Negro slaves could care for the elderly in their home, relieving the sons of New France, relieving the sons in New France of the obligation of caring for their parents. And I just thought that was just such when I first read it, it kind of made me pause and it took my breath away for a second. And I thought, I spent so much time hearing that A, there was not slavery, B, it was not important at that time, C, they were not, they were not integral to the development of the province, certainly the colony at the time. So those are kind of arguments that you hear as a Black historian looking at the records. And then you see that for those colonists at that time, having Black slaves do, well, in this case, caregiving, was really important. And he keeps repeating that. I won't go into that because I'll probably put it in my article So, and of course, it would be quite typical that they would be expected to come in and work in the mines, work in the resources, etc. But actually come in to be expected to care, to do caregiving duties. I thought that was quite novel. So that's sort of where it started. Okay. Oops. Sorry. There we go. All right, so now we're going to take that leap that I told you we were going to. We're going into what is the first domestic scheme. Of course, the 19th century, the period we had in Montreal and across the 5, 6 provinces. At that time, you had the Underground Railroad. You had actually the emancipation of African domestic slaves here in the country, and then the Underground Railroad and the start of what really was a backlash, the Negrophobia period. And here we have sorry, I'm not sure how that. Here we have in 1910 a the first scheme to bring, at least identified, the first scheme since 1719 to bring Black labor here for caregiving purposes. This is an actual picture of the Guadalupean women who were brought in. I just wanted to give you a sense of what they look like. And obviously, I don't know if you've seen any of the pictures, a whole bunch of them now on the web, because they have released some archival footage, photos of these women coming in Ellis Island. I'm not sure. I know that they also had to stop at Pier 21 in Halifax, and I'm not sure if those pictures, if they were taken at that time there as well. But these are from New York, to the customs on Ellis Island, and it was taken by Augustus Sherman. His work is now online. And I noted in some of the articles in Quebec, they refer a lot. You see the headdress that these women were wearing from Guadeloupe and their tropical clothing. You see that in the articles. There are about 40 articles that I examined, and I did specifically in the French press, because these were French Creole speaking women, and they were going into French households. I thought they would be more easily identified from a journalistic perspective in the French press. So fact of their dress, their headdress, is how they're introduced to the readers, to the newspaper readers. So just to give you a little bit of a context, in 1910, it just doesn't show up like that. This is almost the tail end of Canada's domestic scheme, its own campaign, if you will, at the federal government level to bring in domestics from Europe, not from the West Indies at all, not from the Caribbean region, but from the West Indies. And this started, in the 1890s, right up to about, even during this period of domestic scheme, although by this time, a lot of the women who were in domestic work had done their 1 year or 2 or 3, depending on how many years they chose to do it, had moved on, gotten married, had children, which is what point of bringing those young, nubile women from Europe into Canada in the first place. By 1910, teaching is becoming a much more popular form of employment for women. But what happened here with the domestic scheme in 1910, I'm going to explain it a little bit. It's kind of a roundabout way of getting there, but excuse me. The domestic women coming in from Guadeloupe, as I said, were French speaking, and they were supposed to go into the homes of the French. Why? Because that federal scheme bringing in the women from Finland and Sweden and England and wherever into Canada really focused on the caregiving, domestic work needed in English Canada and English households as opposed to French. So the women who came in from Guadeloupe were expected to be, well, childless, because they didn't want them to get pregnant while they were in Montreal, or while they were in Quebec, and or have any days outside of what they were supposed to be doing in the home. Okay, so, you know, to be worried about their children elsewhere if they're childless. Like most of the women who were expected to come in from Europe, the expectation, they were supposed to be virgin. The expectation is that they were to find husbands here and increase the Canadian stock. Not so for these women. The purpose of them being childless, as I said, was to keep their gaze here in the province. So between the age of 21 and 35, and this would then allow them as single women without children to be more dependent on their employers. Excuse me. Also, the other thing to note is that these Black women coming in from Guadeloupe had to sign contracts for 2 years domestic service. So it's no big deal, right? It was, because it was double what women from Europe were signing. Their contracts were for 1 year at a time, which they could renew if they want. But these domestic women, when they signed to come in to work here, had to agree to work for 2 years at less than half the salary or wage that the European women would get. And so the best would get between $12 and $15, right, which was pretty standard. Black women were offered only $5 a month. So government knew, in the initial phases, the government knew that the program, at least for the employers, was very successful. And they actually did a survey and found that the employers were indicating why they wanted this Black labor, why they wanted to keep their Black labor, right? So these women were fond of children, knew their place. In other words, they were servants, and they were acceptable provided, I didn't put it in there, provided they understood that they had to leave the country. Now, this was quite in keeping with government vision of how Black labor, female Black labor, was going to be used. It was never expected that these Black women, like the women from Europe, these Black women would stay and have children. They did not see Black children as being part of the Canadian stock. And that's really the way that they wrote about it. So that when they signed the contract to come, it was, let me see, I'm sorry if I can find it, let's see. It was a contract without it, well, put it clearly, it was a contract that said that as soon as they were finished with their employed, they would leave. So they would not get the benefit of landed immigrant status. Of course, that didn't exist at the time, but an equivalent thereof, where they could go out and stay, mingle in the population, get education, find an apartment, do whatever they wanted after the 2 years. That paper they got with the address of their employer once they got off the train or off the boat into, you know, Montreal or wherever they were going, made it very clear that as soon as their employer was finished with them, they would leave the country. So let me just explain a little bit about how the program was set up. This program actually started in 1910 with Mr. Autier, A.M. Joseph, Miscal, Authier, hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. He was in 1910 a retired consul general of America. He had been born in Rhode Island. He was a French-speaking American, and his family had a home in St. Hyacinthe, Quebec. And he used to summer there and knew the people, was apparently well liked. He had been a trade commissioner there for 10 years, even before he became a consul general to Guadeloupe and in the United States. So in 1910, he puts out an advertisement, sort of a little classified ad in the local paper saying, I have a woman, I pay her $5 a month. Would you like to have a woman come to work with you in your home? You only need to pay for their transportation, which is $80, okay, to bring them from Guadeloupe. And then you thereafter pay them $5 a month. That's the beginnings of this scheme, if you will. And he organized that. He got yeses from, I guess, his neighbors and they said Village, Saint-Hilaire, etc. So he would go to Guadeloupe on vacation. I guess he would meet these women, or he had a third person there who would have contracts set up for him, and he would then arrange for these women to come into the province. So that's how they wind up coming into the province. It starts with him. It doesn't end with him. Well, in a sense, it's not because of that the program ends. It ends because they're sued. The people that bring these women, one of them sues and wins in court, because the contract that she signed was not witnessed properly, whatever, it was a technical reason. And it just basically collapsed the program. So for 2 years, approximately 155 women, and that's only women identified through the newspapers. There probably were others. And I've read of accounts of Black women coming in, piggybacking, if you will, from Martinique and Barbados, etc. And not all of them came into the province. Most of them did. Out of the 155, I think 135 or something of them came to Montreal. The rest were scattered in Beloeil, Trois-Rivières, St. Hyacinthe, Hilaire, in the countryside. And so it's interesting because this is a piece of the Black history in Quebec, not tied to the Black community in Montreal, which is where the Black community was at that time. Because, why? Probably because they were Creole French speakers in the homes of Francophones. Saint-Antoine at the time was a very poor area. Not sure, in fact, it's considered to be the poorest district in Montreal at the time. So they wouldn't have done their domestic work there. So anyway, they're not part of our lore, if you will, or oral history, but certainly in the larger picture of Black domestic labor in this province, they need to be remembered. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the interwar years. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one aspect, a really critical aspect. When the women were, the program shut down, the provincial government and the federal government in lockstep agreed that every single Black woman that had come in the program would be deported. And every single one of them was deported. Even those who had gotten pregnant here, had children here, were deported with their Canadian-born children. Federal government legacy with that, because it was the height of Negrophobia, they used the deportations of these Black women in the domestic scheme, this first domestic scheme, as a perfect excuse or rationale to prove that Black women are morally unfit and they curtailed Black female immigration as a result of that for a decade. Research out there is pretty clear. It was decades long, barring and really curtailing movement of Black women into the country on the basis of the first domestic scheme. Okay, so now in the interwar years, I don't want to take up too much time, I don't want to lose time. This is, we're talking late 20s into the 30s, just pre-war. So I'm going to really be talking about what was going on inside that community, the Montreal Black community in Saint Antoine. Today we call it Little Burgundy. And one of the aspects related to health, related to caregiving, has to do with them being barred in a couple of areas. I'm only going to deal with a couple here. The first one, as you can see, is the Red Cross with an X on it. They were not allowed to join the Red Cross, but it wasn't the only thing they weren't allowed to do at that time. Jim Crow was not legislated, but certainly part of custom. A lot of things that happened in the States were replicated up here vis-a-vis the treatment of Blacks. In the United States and then again in Canada, the Red Cross would not allow Blacks to join, Black women to join. Black health was still an issue. And that's where you get the Black Cross nurses come to the fore and become really important in the community. And also, so I'm going to deal with a little bit later, the exclusion of Black women in the nursing profession. The Black Cross nurses, although they were not professionally trained nurses, Black women provided some care and advice on health and hygiene. And where they could take St. John ambulance courses. I've also read that they were able to take some first aid courses with the Victorian Order of Nurses. I'm not sure about that, but to improve their education that they could give basic medical care in their communities. Quebec's health focus at that time, Quebec had just started a rapid expansion of sanatoria for TB, et cetera. So they were beginning to set up their own network in health at this time. It's not focused on Blacks or any communities in particular. In general, I mean ethnic communities in particular. But in the early years when the Black Cross nurses really become cemented within the not Little Burgundy, the St. Antoine community, they're dealing with what we're dealing with today, which is the pandemic, right? So the pandemic, I don't think ends till around 22 or something like that. It became essential to have really good care because of the conditions, living conditions of Blacks in Antoine at that time. Black Cross nurses or nurses in general do not get to join the Red Cross in Canada until Second World War, where they're then allowed to roll bandages. What these Black Cross nurses were doing beforehand were rolling bandages for the wars, the international wars that were going on in Africa, and they were shipping what they could in terms of medical supplies overseas. This is a really transnational lens rather than a community lens, simply because they were not allowed to do so. It's really, really interesting. Also, the women held fundraisers for Grace Dart Hospital, which at one point was on the north side of what we today would call Little Burgundy. So they were familiar with that hospital and started to raise money. And I believe also some of the doctors, including Dr. Gaspar, was involved in some care aspect of Grace Dart. That's before it moved east. So that's an interesting piece that has yet to be studied. If I get some time, I'm going to also show you what was going on in the United States in the hospitals at that time, and also hospital care. Okay. Okay, so I think I've tried to make the point about nursing being one of those areas. This is professionalized nursing now. I'm not talking about Black women who want to volunteer for the Red Cross, et cetera, but these are young women who want to become professional nurses. By this time, nursing, like teaching 20 years earlier, became sort of the go-to profession for young, bright people who wanted to professionalize themselves. You'll see 2 there. I say 3 is too many. I'm sure you're trying to figure out what the heck Dorothy's talking about. Black women were not allowed to enter nursing school in Canada. There were, by the 30s, I believe, over 100 of them. Even around the time of the Black Cross nurses, there's something like 70 of them. None of them would accept Black. Protests began in the 40s, a coordinated campaign. I've only read one source for that, but from Toronto and Halifax together, apparently, I don't know if it was shame or just trying to tamp down the protests. Some schools did allow Black candidates to be admitted in their nursing programs. However, they never allowed more than 2 nurses at a time, 2 nursing candidates at a time. And I'm sure you can't figure out why. It's very, very strange. It's because if you think about a dorm room, you send your kids off to college or you went to college, there was always 2 beds in the room. They didn't want to give up more than 1 room. And they would never at that time have put a Black candidate student in a room with a white candidate student. And so it was most, they could say, hey, we're open to accepting Blacks, never more than 2 Blacks at a time, regardless of whether they graduated 40 per year or 60 or 20. It could never be more than 2 because they could only give up, or they were only willing to give up 1 room for 2 Black nurses at a time. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so I'm sure most of you know what I mean, when somebody says a glass ceiling or a concrete ceiling, there's only so far you could go, right? So as I said, Black nurses were not allowed for the longest time. And it created a real problem within the community, particularly young girls who were very bright, who could do all of the training, were not allowed. Now you see here this statement, white patients would not allow Black nurse. That was actually said to Reverend S. Reverend S of Union United Church, who at the behest of, he was chaplain of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and was tasked with the responsibility of going out and seeing if he could drum up support to allow Black nurses to be admitted into the hospitals. Some places did not have nursing schools, but rather nursing training happened in hospitals directly. So he went to Montreal General, the superintendent of nursing, and made the plea to have, in particular, one young, very bright Black child entered into the nursing program. And this was the retort. But wouldn't allow it because at that time, negrophobia was so high, not just in Canada, not just in the United States, but yes, in Montreal, that within Montreal hospitals, they did not believe that white patients would allow a Black nurse to touch them. So she was refused. So he goes outside of the nursing profession and as a United minister, has connections in the Jewish community, the Anglican community, Episcopalian community. He's very much involved in the very early ecumenical movements within Montreal. So he goes to one of his allies, or what he believed was an ally, which was the Bishop of Montreal, the Anglican bishop, I think the premier mainstream church at that time. And again, asks for his help to intercede on behalf of this, what he believed, what the community believed was a quite gifted young Black woman, child actually, because he would have been, I think, less than 20 at the time. Anyway, his retort, very similar with the same result. He was not willing to intercede for Reverend S and to make a difference. So this called white collar glass ceiling meant also, people think about it and just in terms of nursing, and most of the time that's where it ends. But we also had the same issue in terms of doctors. McGill, well, it wasn't unusual for McGill to have his quota system. But when Black doctors did come in to do their residency, their training at McGill, they could only go so far with McGill because they were very sensitive to regional hospitals and private practices refusing to accept Black candidates for any kind of training whatsoever. And told the candidates when they came that they may, depending on the reaction, have to go to the United States to complete their course and not in McGill. And most of these, of course, were foreign students. Local students were local students, whether they were nurses or doctors or doctoral and medical candidates. It was the same issue. They did not want Canadian-born. Let's see if I have that here. They didn't want Canadian-born children to take these courses and to become professionals. As far as they could read the job market, if you will, the labor market, the professional market, they wouldn't A, get into professional associations, and B, they wouldn't have a successful practice. It would have been a waste of time. So this is why the push constantly to go back to the United States. Well, not back to, for some, they had no roots in the United States, but that's where they were told to go. And the story of Vivian Lane Solon, she's the young woman that Reverend S was advocating for. She's one of several that lost the opportunity to do their training here in Montreal. And she took up his suggestion, and she just went to the United States and got her training there. I bring her into the story, A, because she was the focus of Reverend S advocacy, and second, because when she did leave, so with no opportunities in this city, Vivian trained at Lincoln School for Nurses in New York and found employment there. She achieved some measure of fame when it became known she was the attending nurse for Martin Luther King Jr. when he was stabbed in New York in September 20th, 1958. That's actually remembered in the community that she was there. We lost, and it was a brain drain. That's, you know, that was one, I guess, if you will, one of the legacies of exclusion here in the city is we lost our brightest. She never came back even after her nursing training. Okay, so I just want to say,
could we just check in with the time for a sec? Excuse me.
I'm sorry?
I just want to check in for the time. It's 1:45.
Okay, and I can finish very quickly. I'm only like 3 slides away from the end, my friend.
Okay,
is that okay?
Sorry, yes, sorry for the interruption. Thanks.
Okay, that's fine. So I did explain, I think people can imagine what the fallout was when you lose your greatest kid. Okay, so I just want to talk about quickly, because again, this is probably the most known of all of the 4 that I'm sharing with you today, the second domestic scheme, which happened in 1950. And it was the beginnings of what I call Caribbeanization in Canada, right across the country. These were the very first picture of the very first group of domestics that came in 1954 into the city, 54, 55. They got together every Thursday afternoon on their day off, usually at the Negro Community Center once it's set itself up. And so you have a picture, and also that's where they're socializing, because most of the other times they were in the homes of their employers. I won't go into why this scheme came together. However, I will say it was done reluctantly. I can say that categorically, simply because the government at the time wanted to expand their economic footprint, their financial footprint in the West Indies. And a lot of the island nations said, well, you're not even opening the door to allow our young women into the country. And remember, we go all the way back to the deportations of the Guadeloupean domestics. So this is now about 40 years, and they were saying, enough. We are not going to allow any more banks, mining, whatever, from Canadian business until Canada opens up. And this is the result of that domestic scheme. I'm going to just quickly go through this here. Right, so the only key, well, not the only, the major critical aspect that I want to bring up here is that the influx of the domestic scheme, the women from this particular domestic scheme, created a tenfold population growth, which we are still experiencing in Canada. I don't mean the same level of immigration, but certainly through birth and family expansion. So that fundamentally changed the Black community in this country and Canada's ethnic makeup as well. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you, Lorraine, I didn't have a clock in front of me. Thank you very much. That's sort of where I'm going to go. I'm missing a couple of other things, but that's okay. Thank you.
Well, Dorothy,
I hope it was at least useful.
Thank you, Dorothy, for this presentation. I just want people to know something. Dorothy's doing groundbreaking work here. And as I'll mention in a few minutes, we'll put a link in the chat to our newsletter where you can get news on our activities, including the uploading of a paper Dorothy's working on this topic. And I've had the privilege of seeing a draft of her paper. It's groundbreaking, Dorothy. And you've got centuries to cover, and we're very, very appreciative that we're the first to know about this narrative that you're creating of Black caregivers from very, very early on in the history of Quebec, when it was still New France. And so I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to have people know that it will be in print so that people can get some details. We've got about 5 minutes now for questions. So I'll take a look at some of the questions I have seen. Someone wrote, Bobby Varianzas wrote a while back, Dorothy, how long did this go on? And I believe that comment was made when you were talking about restrictions to Black women's access to nursing programs. Because the comment is, how long did it go on for, and when were Black women accepted?
You mean when they were accepted into nursing school?
I think that's
yeah, it took a while for full-scale acceptance. I mean, that protest in the 1940s, as I said, it only yielded, sort of opened the door a crack. Those kinds of changes are actually need to be forced. And once you start, shall I say, embedding human rights legislation, which says you cannot discriminate against, then it becomes very clear that they must make a change in their policies. And it changed from province to province. I can't give you a clear date because it would have affected province by province. Just like certain changes in schools affected province by province. It's not national.
Dorothy, just to let you know, there's a comment, not a question. Sharon writes, my mom came as a domestic from Barbados and eventually studied to be an RN. So we distributed news of this lunch and learn to the local hospitals. I hope that there are some people from the hospitals in the audience. Feel free to write if that is the case in the chat. But I really hope that people can connect to the legacy of Black women as caregivers, nurses, and even doctors eventually. Dorothy, I have a comment and a question myself while we wait to see if anyone else writes a question in the chat. And if I've missed one, please just put it again in the chat. I heard a talk the other day by Dominique Deslandres from Université de Montréal about slavery in New France. And I'll send you the reference to her name. It was after I read your first draft. She said that she found that a lot of the Black slaves coming in were very young, they're children. And she inquired, she poked around the records to find out why. And it's actually very much in line with what you found, which is the vision was for Black slaves to be caregivers for the colonists when they got old. So interestingly, they would hire or buy young Black slaves as basically a guarantee against their old age. And it was particularly for to keep them independent from their own children, the colonists, which is very interesting. So I wonder, Dorothy, if that's a very interesting perspective. If yes. You have some comments to make about the place of Black women in the household.
I certainly do, because I also in my I will be developing this idea of, we often think of slaves in the fields. When you're talking about the uniqueness of Quebec, that's one of them. They really preferred them as domestics in the home. That's not to say they didn't work outside the home doing gardening or whatever. Generally, they were not expected to be in the fields. They wanted them to live a long time or longer. So I'll give you a quote here. Widows and the elderly who have no children fit to work would no longer be forced by their powerlessness to abandon their homes or sell them for a pittance. If slaves could work the land and care, then elderly parents would no longer depend on their children in conditions that caused all sorts of tragedies. And that's written, just in the 18th century. That's really understanding like what you're saying. So he's really just, I guess we're just layering it on each other, but it's the whole idea of Black labor specifically for caregiving in Quebec. It's very unique. I'm not sure that we see that anywhere else on the continent in terms of a main driver, if you will, for acquiring Black slaves.
Here's a great question from Carol Meindl. Dorothy, yeah, and I want to say, added on to the fact that in the New France period, people were comfortable having slaves as caregivers, but later you said they weren't. And Carol said, what exactly was the fear about being touched by Black nurses? What did they think would happen to them?
We didn't have time to talk about the development of Negrophobia in the country. But layered on this reaction to Blackness is the fact that we were right in the height of Negrophobia at the time. What is Negrophobia? Well, a fear of Blacks, and phobia is a fear. And it was really perpetuated in the country with a number of I guess, popular elements. One of them was the rise and persistence in Quebec of blackface. And if you know anything about blackface, blackface was deliberately designed to denigrate Blacks. That was the whole point of creating this Black comic opera. The characters in it are sort of very formulaic kind of form of popular, I won't say skits or acts or songs, entertainment. Sorry, that's probably the better word. But amidst all of that was the fact that Blacks were they were the focus of the blackface, to be denigrated, to be laughed at. And they had specific characters in them, which were supposed to be very realistic to the Blacks on plantations in the South, and representative of Blacks in general. So there was the hypersexualized Black man. There was the super sultry female fatale Black woman, usually mulatto. There was the mammy, there was the dandy, there was the buffoon, there were all of these characters or caricatures created to so that it could entertain the population sitting and drinking and having supper or being in the theater, being entertained and laughed at, each one of them being played off as a buffoon, intelligent, scary, dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And so to get this fed into popular culture, plus the effect of Birth of the Nation, Gone with the Wind, all of these popular depictions of Blacks, either they want to go back to slavery because they were treated better there, or the whole idea of a free Black man is a dangerous Black man. And so that kind of all fed into this idea of Blacks could never attain equality to whites, and they need to be feared because particularly Black males were perceived as being a sexual threat to women. So that all just played in the whole idea of being fearful of having Black blood in the Canadian strain, their stock, if you will. And it also played into the whole idea of even Black women being undesirable, dirty, and not being stupid to make mistakes, right? Even though it was known, like particularly in Vivian's case, she was first in her class. I mean, she was apparently quite brilliant and very gifted. She played the piano, she did this, she did that. It was for naught. The color of her skin was the most important characteristic that they used to define who she was and what she could become. So you see that happening all over. It's quite sad, but that's Negrophobia, and it lasted in Canada even after the Second World War. We still went through a period of it. I think till about the mid-60s. People, most historians who are looking at that say it ended there. That's a long time. That's about 1870s, 1880s, all the way to 1960s. A long time. That really underpins policies, rules, regulations, et cetera, and sort of that embedding, that systemic racism becomes embedded over decades of practice, right? So I'm saying it's not a short answer, but I try to help understand. I didn't go into what Negrophobia was and why it was so critical to layering on this this fear, this animosity towards anything Black at that time. It just made no sense whatsoever, but that's not, racism doesn't make sense, so.
Thank you, Dorothy. We have several more questions.
Okay.
Was the Black Cross Nurse Organization sponsored by the Canadian government?
No. The Black Cross nurses were an auxiliary of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Today, we know them as the UNIALL. The only branch I think that's available that is open still in Canada is here in Montreal on the corner of Notre Dame and Water. But at one time, there were 36 branches, I think, opened across the country. And these Canadian clubs or Canadian community centers were part of a network of 6 million Black people around the world who were members of the UNIA. The UNIA was the largest, and still to this day, largest Black organization ever created in the history of mankind. Black Cross Nurses was an auxiliary of it, because the conditions we had here in Montreal in terms of lack of access, health access, et cetera, was replicated everywhere in the world. Hospitals, I have some material which I found about, for instance, in 1915 in Alabama, there was a law passed which said no person or corporation shall require any white female nurse to nurse in wards or rooms in the hospital, either public or private, in which Negro men are placed. It's 1915. And even though it's a law in Alabama, that kinds of thing becomes practice in other states, as you know, just like the anti-abortion, right? So you get one place that has a law, and then the others just kind of becomes the custom. So it was a law that basically denied African Americans guaranteed access to proper medical care. So if you don't allow nurses, Black nurses, to train and to be in those hospitals working side by side with white nurses, but then you also say that white nurses cannot touch a Black man, then Black men are at an incredible disadvantage if they get sick. 1955, we say, oh, well, by the 1950s, it's got to be better. No, the Board of Control in Georgia passed a law saying that in terms of hospital apartments, because they would have dorms and whatever, in no case shall Negroes and white persons be together. So this affected both training, but it also affected if you were in a ward, if you did get sick and you were in a hospital bed and they needed to put a white person there and it was the only bed that you would be moved. And you could literally be moved out of the hospital because your space was never primary. It's always a white person's space. So it's things like that. In Mississippi in 1917, entrances and waiting rooms for all hospitals were segregated. And in other places, if you were Black and you were sick, you had to go into the basement of the hospital. You sat there, you waited until the patients upstairs until there was a lull, then the doctors would come down and treat you. So it's what I'm talking about here in Montreal. It's not that kind of extreme. It didn't get codified into law. And that's the interesting thing about Jim Crow, right? In Canada, people say it's polite racism. It's not on the books. It's still practiced.
Dorothy, another comment. Elizabeth Ann Williams, who's here with us still, wrote, in 1969, I came in a group of domestics. I became an RN in 75, 30 years, now retired. So welcome, Elizabeth Ann, and thank you for attending.
Thank you. I hope that even for some of the people that have been through the system, they learned something new today.
Leonie writes, how do you do this work, conduct this kind of research, and still be able to smile? That's a good question.
Wow. What an interesting question. How can I do this? I guess the other side of that is the expectation that it angers people, and the expectation is that I would carry that anger. But to me, that is energy I can do without. I need to be focused on what I'm doing. I need to love what I'm doing. It's not pleasant, but I'm also very much aware that a lot of the research that I'm putting together, nobody else is doing. Nobody else has done over the last 30 or 40 years. And we just don't have enough scholars to say, well, it can be taken care of. And I'm still excited about learning and the whole idea of educating myself, trying to become a better writer and a better researcher, and giving myself opportunities to help educate the population at large. Not particularly great about teaching. I don't like teaching. I love educating. And so if I learn and I can get excited about it, just at the newness of it, and I guess sometimes I'm gobsmacked by the fact that, well, why doesn't anybody know this? And then I get opportunities in which to share it. I feel like I have there's a measure of satisfaction in me about having contributed something positive.
Thank you, Dorothy. We've got a couple more questions. I just want to let you know, Althea Robinson expresses great concern, especially for the topic you discussed, especially the young women who were, after misogyny and racism, were deported.
Yes.
Another question.
Just a second. Can I just go back to that for a second?
Yes,
I just want to make a comment. One of the reasons I want to bring that out, and I will continue to bring out that story, other people are trying to now, is we need to go back. We do need to understand the importance of this short-lived domestic scheme and its impact, not just on Canada. It certainly had an impact on Canada. We don't talk about it we don't talk about anything about blacks in schools. But also, what happened to those Canadian-born kids when they went home? Has anybody looked at the link between Canada and Guadeloupe or other islands that may have had the situation? And also, of course, these Black women were not fraternizing with Black men. Who were the father of those children? Are those memories still there in those particular families when they went home with these children? Now they would be grandparents themselves or great-grandparents. Is that family history? Is that part of their family history, their experience in Montreal? There's so many pieces of that still have yet to be explored, and hopefully will be picked up by other generations. Go ahead, Rain, please.
Yeah, it's so important, this research. Evadne writes, were there any stipulations regarding the Black women who came to Canada for the first and second domestic schemes? Could they easily become Canadian citizens?
Absolutely not. Well, sorry, hold on. The second scheme was set up so that they could. In 1955, that was almost with their hand behind their back, Canada finally agreeing that Black women could stay and then sponsor. And that took a lot of protests and campaigning from within and outside the country. And even being, how shall I say, shamed on the international scene about the way Canada's barring Black people from coming into the country. Now, the first group, as I mentioned before, their status was totally different. The script that they got, they would literally get off the train or come off the boat, and they would have a piece of paper in their hand with the address of where they were going. It was already set up for them. Also, in terms of their status as migrants, it was very clear that they had to return when they were finished. They would not even be given the opportunity to become Canadian. So 2 different treatments, but it's interesting that we talk about the second, of course, because of its impact is contemporaneous. It's like right with us right now. But what happened with those women really had a big effect on Black communities for decades.
A final question, and then I'll have to wrap up. From Leonie. Dorothy, can you say specifically what was done in Montreal to change that fear? What was done by the Canadian government? So I think the question...
I'm missing something there, my friend.
Yeah, can you say specifically what was done in Montreal to change that fear? I think this is picking up on your discussion of negrophobia and fear of being touched by Black women. What was done by the government? What, in other words, has that changed? Have things changed, or how did they change and why?
Well, as I said, what changed is that they were forced to through passing of human rights legislation, the same way human rights legislation and the challenges in the courts against restaurants saying, we're not going to serve you because you're Black, you know, and this kind of thing that happened. And they got away with that for decades, of course, because of the primacy of the, you know, the business person, the entrepreneur making the choice as to what and who they will serve. And then the law, the human rights legislation gets passed, which supersedes all laws, because all laws must be under it, and says you cannot discriminate, and changes it. So reluctantly or willingly, they wind up having to open up and just open their door a crack. And then when they realize that they're not going to lose, because a lot of the times the reason they're saying we don't want Blacks here or Jews here or whatever, is because they're afraid that their regular clientele will walk away from them if they start to allow those people in. When they realize that